Nurse caring for comatose wife falls desperately in love with husband. Her secret will destroy you. Julian's hands trembled as he stared at the handwriting on the birthday card, the same elegant script that had appeared mysteriously for 7 years. His wife, Marissa, lay motionless in her hospital bed, as she had since the accident. But standing in the doorway was Sarah, the night nurse, her face pale with shock. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered, backing away. "I never meant for you to know it was me." The birthday card fluttered from Julian's numb fingers, landing beside Marissa's bedside table, where it joined 6 others he'd brought today. 7 years of mysterious comfort, 7 years of wondering who cared enough to remember his birthday when he'd forgotten how to celebrate anything. The elegant handwriting had been his only connection to hope, his single thread to a world that still believed in kindness without conditions. Julian Thorne was 38 years old, though grief had aged him beyond his years. Silver threads wove through his dark hair prematurely, and his tall frame carried an invisible weight that made him seem permanently stooped with sorrow. He was a senior architect at Morrison Design Group, specializing in hospital and healthcare facilities, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on him as he spent his days designing spaces for healing while his own world remained frozen in time. Every day for 7 years, Julian had followed the same ritual. Leave work at exactly 5:30, drive the familiar route to St. Catherine's Medical Center, park in the same spot in the visitor's garage, walk through corridors he could navigate blindfolded to room 314 in the long-term care unit, sit beside his wife's bed for 2 hours, reading aloud from books she'd once loved, sharing details of his day with someone who might or might not hear him. Marissa Thorne lay exactly as she had since the night that changed everything, peaceful, preserved, perfect in her stillness. The accident 7 years ago had stolen her consciousness, but left her face unmarked, her auburn hair still catching light from the window, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision thanks to the ventilator. She was 36 when time stopped for both of them. The first birthday card had arrived exactly 1 year after the accident, on Julian's 32nd birthday, a day he'd planned to ignore entirely. The envelope bore no return address, just his name written in flowing script that seemed to dance across cream-colored paper. Inside, words that felt like a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Some birthdays are harder than others, but you are still here, still breathing, still capable of tomorrow's surprises. That alone is worth celebrating." Julian had kept that card, and every one that followed. Each year, like clockwork, another envelope would appear in his mailbox, never the same message, but always the same understanding. Someone out there recognized his pain without judgment, acknowledged his struggle without platitudes. The cards became his anchor, proof that kindness existed even in a world that felt impossibly cruel. And now, staring at Serafina Brown, Sarah, the woman who'd been his wife's night nurse for over 2 years, Julian's carefully ordered world tilted sideways. Sarah was beautiful in an understated way that seemed to glow brighter under fluorescent hospital lights. At 32, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her movements through the ward graceful and purposeful. Her dark skin held warm undertones that made her seem to radiate health in a place where hope often went to die. Tonight, her usually composed features were etched with vulnerability and something that looked dangerously close to fear. 7 years, Sarah. Julian's voice cracked with emotion, the words emerging rougher than he'd intended. 7 years you watched me suffer and said nothing? Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, still backing toward the hallway, as if physical distance could somehow undo this moment. "I never meant for you to find out. The cards, they weren't supposed to be traced back to me." But Julian stepped forward, driven by 7 years of unanswered questions. "You watched me grieve. You saw me break down in this room more times than I can count, and all this time, you were." "I was trying to help," Sarah interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You looked so lost, so completely destroyed. I recognized that kind of pain." Something in her tone made Julian pause, the way she said recognized, not observed, not sympathized with, but recognized. As if she'd worn the same expression he saw in mirrors, carried the same weight he felt pressing against his chest every morning. "What do you mean, recognized?" Sarah's composure cracked slightly, revealing depths he'd never noticed during their polite professional interactions. I lost someone too, someone who meant everything to me. I know what it feels like to have your world just stop. Julian found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Who? My grandmother, Sarah's voice grew soft with memory. She raised me in New Orleans after my parents died. Hurricane Katrina took her when I was 25. I was supposed to be there, supposed to evacuate her, but I was stuck at the hospital. Couldn't leave my patients. The admission hung between them, heavy with shared understanding. Julian saw himself reflected in her eyes, the guilt, the what-ifs, the crushing weight of responsibility for someone else's fate. The card started as professional compassion, Sarah continued, her defenses crumbling with each word. I saw how you spoke to her, how you never missed a day, never stopped hoping. But over time, they became something else. You became... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would change everything. Julian reached out, his instinct to comfort overriding everything else. When his fingers gently circled her wrist, stopping her retreat, the contact sent unexpected electricity through both of them. Sarah's pulse hammered against his thumb, and her breath caught audibly. They stood frozen, staring at each other as something fundamental shifted between them. Her skin was warm, softer than he'd imagined during countless professional interactions. The simple touch awakened awareness he'd thought permanently buried, how her scrubs couldn't hide the feminine curves beneath, how her eyes held flecks of gold that caught the afternoon light, how her lips were parted slightly in surprise. For her part, Sarah became acutely conscious of Julian's proximity, the way his grief-worn features held traces of the handsome man he'd been before tragedy. His thumb stroking unconsciously across her pulse point sent heat spiraling through her body in ways that had nothing to do with professional care and everything to do with suppressed longing. Sarah, we need you in room 314. Dr. Okafor's voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a blade. Julian dropped her wrist immediately, both stepping back as if caught in something forbidden. Which, Sarah realized with dawning horror, they were. Dr. Adaora Okafor, head of neurology, appeared in the doorway with the efficient authority that made her one of the hospital's most respected physicians. Her sharp eyes took in the scene. Julian's flushed face, Sarah's obvious distress, the birthday card scattered on the floor. Mr. Thorne, Dr. Okafor nodded professionally. How is your wife today? The question landed like a physical blow. Sarah watched Julian's face transform, watched him remember where they were, what this was, who lay unconscious just feet away from their moment of connection. She's the same, Julian managed, his voice hollow. Dr. Okafor's expression softened slightly. I'll be conducting her monthly evaluation next week. We'll discuss any changes then. As the doctor moved efficiently to Marissa's bedside, checking monitors and making notations, Sarah used the distraction to slip away. Julian watched her go, noting how she carefully avoided looking at him, how her shoulders carried new tension. That evening, Julian couldn't concentrate on the architectural plans spread across his home office desk. His riverside apartment, once shared with Marissa, had become a monument to suspended time, her coffee mug still in the sink, her bookmark holding place in a novel she'd never finish, her side of the bed undisturbed for 7 years. But tonight, the familiar weight of preserved grief felt different. Tonight, he kept replaying the moment when Sarah's wrist had pulsed beneath his touch, when her eyes had widened with awareness that had nothing to do with professional boundaries. 7 years of anonymous comfort suddenly had a face, a name, a reason that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't identify. Sarah had been watching over him from the shadows, understanding his pain in ways no one else had even attempted. The thought should comfort him. Instead, it terrified him. Because for the first time since the accident, Julian Thorne had felt something other than grief. And that something was directed toward the woman who cared for his wife every night, who'd been secretly sending him hope for 7 years, who'd just shattered his carefully ordered world with a single, whispered confession. He returned to the hospital near midnight, ostensibly to sit with Marissa as he sometimes did during difficult nights. But if he was honest, and Julian was trying very hard not to be, he hoped to see Sarah again. He found her in the break room, still in her scrubs, staring at an untouched cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too many people's pain. "Rough night?" Julian asked quietly. Sarah looked up, startled. Her defenses immediately rose. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Thorne." Visiting hours ended at 9. "It's Julian," he said, settling into the chair across from her despite her obvious discomfort. "And they don't enforce those rules strictly in long-term care. You know that. She did know that. Families keeping vigil, Hope refusing to follow hospital schedules. She'd seen it countless times. But Julian's presence felt different now, charged with awareness that made her profoundly uncomfortable. "We lost Mr. Rodriguez tonight," Sarah said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Room 318. He'd been here 3 years. Julian remembered the elderly man whose family visited every weekend, whose wife brought fresh flowers twice a week. "I'm sorry." His wife. She thanked me for taking care of him. Sarah's composure began to crack. She said I made his final years bearable. The pain in her voice was naked, raw. Julian recognized it because he'd felt it, the crushing responsibility of caring for someone who might never respond, never improve, never wake up to say thank you or goodbye. "But you did," Julian said gently. "You made his final years bearable." "Did I?" Sarah looked up, tears threatening. "Or did I give her false hope? Did I make it harder by treating him like he could hear every word, feel every touch?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to acknowledge, because they both knew she wasn't just talking about Mr. Rodriguez anymore. "I don't understand," Julian said, his voice roughening with emotion. "Why did you care so much about a stranger's pain? Why send the cards? Why risk?" "Because sometimes strangers are the only ones who can see our heart without judgment," Sarah interrupted, the words emerging like a confession torn from somewhere deep inside her. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with recognition and possibility and danger. When Sarah stood to leave, exhaustion making her movements slow, Julian's hand found hers, naturally. This time, neither pulled away. Her fingers were slender but strong, calloused from years of caring for others, warm despite the break room's chill. Julian's thumb traced across her knuckles, and Sarah's breath caught at the tenderness in the gesture. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, unsure what he meant to say. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers seemed to fit perfectly between hers, at the wedding ring he still wore that caught fluorescent light like a warning. "This is wrong," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. Have you ever discovered that someone has been silently caring for you from the shadows, sending you hope when you needed it most? Tell me your story in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. And hit subscribe if Julian and Sarah's unexpected connection is already pulling at your heartstrings. 3 weeks passed in a careful dance of avoidance and magnetic attraction. Julian found excuses to visit during Sarah's shifts, and she found reasons to linger in his wife's room longer than necessary. Their conversations deepened incrementally, professional discussions that somehow evolved into personal revelations. Sarah shared stories of growing up in New Orleans with her grandmother, a woman who'd taught her that healing came through attention and love, not just medicine. Julian opened up about his architectural work, how he'd specialized in healthcare design after meeting Marissa during the renovation of this very hospital. She'd been a social worker then, advocating for patient family spaces, and her passion had inspired his career focus. But the more they talked, the more dangerous their connection became. The breaking point came during a heated discussion about treatment approaches. Julian had observed Sarah talking to coma patients as if they were fully conscious, playing their favorite music, treating them with dignity that went beyond standard care protocols. "You're giving families false hope," Julian argued, his voice tight with emotions he couldn't name. "These aren't people anymore. Their bodies kept alive by machines." Sarah whirled to face him, fire sparking in her dark eyes. Don't you dare reduce them to biology and machines." She stepped closer, close enough that Julian could see the passion burning in her expression, could catch the faint scent of her perfume beneath the clinical smell of hospital disinfectant. Your wife isn't just a body being kept alive, Sarah continued, her voice shaking with conviction. She's Marissa, who loved romantic comedies and terrible pop music. She's the woman who chose sunshine yellow for her hospital room because it made her feel hopeful. She's someone's daughter, someone's friend, your wife, and I treat her with the dignity she deserves. But she doesn't respond, Julian said, his voice cracking. 7 years, Sarah. 7 years of reading to her, talking to her, hoping for some sign that she's still in. There. Nothing. Not even a flutter of her eyelids. So you've given up? The accusation hit like a physical blow. I haven't given up. I'm here every day. No, Sarah said softly, and somehow her gentleness was more devastating than anger. You're serving penance. There's a difference. They stood facing each other in the narrow corridor, both breathing hard from the intensity of their exchange. The argument had brought them close enough that Julian could see the gold flecks in Sarah's brown eyes, could feel the heat radiating from her body, could count the rapid rise and fall of her chest beneath her scrubs. Something shifted in the space between them, anger transforming into awareness, professional distance collapsing into dangerous proximity. Julian's gaze dropped to her lips, slightly parted from their passionate exchange, and Sarah's breath caught audibly. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they teetered on the edge of something that would change everything. Then, footsteps in the nearby stairwell broke the spell, and both stepped back as if burned. But the damage was done. The awareness between them could no longer be denied or dismissed as professional compassion. Julian was falling for his comatose wife's nurse, and Sarah, God help her, was falling right back. Chapter 2. 2 days later, during an emotional conversation about the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, Sarah nearly collapsed from exhaustion and accumulated grief. Julian instinctively reached out, catching her against his chest as her knees buckled. The contact was electric, her body soft and warm against his, fitting perfectly in his arms as if designed to be there. His hand lingered on her lower back, feeling the delicate curve of her spine through her scrubs. Sarah's palms pressed against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat accelerating beneath her touch. For a moment, neither moved, both stunned by how right this felt despite how wrong they knew it was. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, but she didn't pull away. "Don't be sorry," Julian murmured, his voice rough with emotions he'd thought permanently buried. "Not for this." Their faces were inches apart, breath mingling, the rest of the world fading to irrelevance. Julian's free hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the elegant line of her cheekbone, and Sarah's eyes fluttered closed at the tenderness. But reality intruded in the form of approaching voices, and they separated hastily, both shaking from the intensity of connection neither had expected. 1 week later, Julian discovered Sarah crying in a supply closet after losing a young patient, a 24-year-old woman who'd been in a coma since a motorcycle accident 6 months earlier. The family had finally made the decision to withdraw life support, and Sarah had held the young woman's hand until the very end. Without thinking, Julian pulled her into his arms. What began as comfort transformed into something deeper, as Sarah's tears soaked his shirt and her body molded against his. Their shared understanding of loss, of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves, created an intimacy that transcended physical attraction. Sarah tilted her face up to his, eyes bright with unshed tears, lips parted slightly as if she might speak. Julian's head lowered instinctively, drawn by something stronger than logic or ethics. Their lips almost met, a breath apart, hearts racing, the promise of connection hanging between them like suspended time. Then, Dr. Okafor's voice echoed in the nearby hallway, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers, both breathing hard from almost crossing a line that would change everything. The near kiss haunted them both. Julian found himself staring at Sarah's mouth during their careful conversations, remembering how close he'd come to tasting her lips. Sarah caught herself watching his hands, remembering how gently he'd cupped her face, how his touch had made her feel cherished rather than simply desired. Their relationship was evolving into something neither could deny, something that made every professional interaction charged with suppressed longing. And as October turned to November, as the anniversary of their card connection approached, the tension between them built toward an inevitable breaking point. The night everything changed began with an unexpected storm. By 8 in the evening, Thunder Bay was battered by winds that howled like living things and rain that turned the world into a watercolor painting viewed through tears. The hospital activated emergency protocols as power fluctuated throughout the building, and all non-essential personnel were asked to remain on site until the storm passed. Julian had been visiting Marissa when the lights first flickered. He'd been reading aloud from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, her favorite novel, one he'd read to her dozens of times over the years, when the building shuddered under a particularly vicious gust of wind. "Looks like we're here for the night," Sarah said, appearing in the doorway with her usual quiet grace. She'd been making rounds, checking on patients and reassuring families trapped by the weather. Julian looked up from the book, struck by how the storm's atmospheric pressure seemed to make everything feel more intense, more immediate. Sarah's scrubs were slightly damp from checking on patients whose rooms had windows that leaked, and her usually perfect ponytail showed signs of the humidity. "How are the other patients?" Julian asked, closing the book and setting it on Marissa's bedside table, next to the collection of birthday cards he still brought during every visit. "Stable. Mrs. Patterson in 320 is anxious about the storm, but her daughter's with her." Mr. Kim's family decided to wait it out in the family lounge. Sarah moved to check Marissa's monitors, her movements efficient and caring. "The generators are running smoothly, so all the life support systems are stable." She'd been caring for Marissa for over 2 years, and Julian had watched her work hundreds of times. But tonight, as she adjusted his wife's blankets and checked IV lines with gentle precision, he found himself seeing her differently. Not just as the competent nurse who kept his wife comfortable, but as the woman who'd been quietly sending him hope for 7 years, who'd recognized his pain and responded with anonymous kindness. "Why did you never sign the cards?" Julian asked suddenly. Sarah's hands stilled on Marissa's blanket. "What do you mean?" "For 7 years, you sent me exactly what I needed to hear, exactly when I needed to hear it, but you never signed them, never claimed credit for the kindness." She resumed her tasks, but Julian could see the tension in her shoulders. "Because it wasn't about credit. It was about you not feeling so alone." "But you were alone too," Julian said, understanding dawning. "After Katrina, after losing your grandmother. You were grieving too, but you spent your energy comforting a stranger." Sarah finished with Marissa's care and turned to face him, vulnerability naked in her expression. "Sometimes it's easier to heal others than to heal ourselves." The admission hung between them, heavy with recognition. Here they were, 2 people who'd built their lives around caring for others who couldn't reciprocate, who'd found each other through shared loss and mutual understanding. "Sarah," Julian began, but the lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness before the emergency generators kicked in with a low hum. "I should check the other rooms," Sarah said, but she didn't move. "They're all stable. You said so yourself. The family lounge might need—" "Sarah." Julian stood, moving closer to her with deliberate intent. "For once, stop taking care of everyone else." She looked up at him, and in the dim emergency lighting, her eyes held a vulnerability he'd never seen during their professional interactions. "I don't know how. Let me show you." The words emerged rough with longing, and Sarah's breath caught at the promise in his voice. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside Marissa's room, time seemed suspended as 2 people who'd been circling each other for months finally acknowledged what had been building between them. Julian reached out slowly, giving Sarah every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she actually swayed slightly toward him, he cupped her face with both hands. Her skin was warm and impossibly soft, and when his thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, she leaned into the touch with a soft sigh. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "I know. Your wife is here, and so are you. And for the first time in 7 years, I feel alive." Their faces drew closer, breath mingling in the charged air. This time, no interruption saved them from crossing the line they'd been approaching for weeks. When Julian's lips finally touched Sarah's, the kiss was gentle, reverent, full of suppressed longing and mutual recognition. Sarah's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, as 7 years of anonymous connection transformed into physical reality. The kiss deepened naturally, and Julian marveled at how perfectly she fit against him, how her lips seemed designed for his, how kissing her felt like coming home after an impossibly long journey. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, shaken by the intensity of connection neither had fully anticipated. "We can't do this here," Sarah whispered, glancing toward Marissa's still form. Julian followed her gaze, reality crashing back with devastating force. His wife lay 3 feet away, maintained by machines, while he kissed another woman in her presence. The guilt should have been crushing, but instead he felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years, hope for a future that included joy rather than just obligation. "The family counseling room," Julian suggested. "It locks from the inside." Sarah nodded, her decision made. They left Marissa's room quietly, like conspirators fleeing a crime scene, and made their way through corridors dimmed by emergency lighting to the small room where families received difficult news and made impossible decisions. Julian locked the door behind them, and suddenly they were truly alone for the first time since their relationship had begun to evolve beyond professional boundaries. The room was furnished simply: comfortable chairs, soft lighting, tissues strategically placed for moments when hope finally gave way to grief. But tonight, it would witness something different. Tonight, it would see the beginning of love that had grown in the shadows of loss. Sarah stood near the window, watching rain streak the glass in patterns that looked like tears. Julian approached slowly, giving her space to change her mind, to remember all the reasons why this was complicated and dangerous and possibly wrong. Instead, she turned to face him, and her expression held no doubt, only longing that matched his own. "I've wanted this for so long," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "How long?" Julian asked, reaching for her hands. "Since the first time I saw you reading to her," Sarah confessed. "You were reading poetry in your voice. There was so much love in it, so much devotion. I thought, this is what love looks like. This is what it means to truly care for someone." Julian's throat tightened with emotion. "I stopped feeling love for a long time. I felt duty, obligation, guilt, but not love. Not until I discovered that the woman who'd been sending me hope was someone who understood hope herself, someone who chose to care for broken people every day, who found beauty in moments others might see as hopeless." They moved toward each other like magnets, drawn by forces stronger than logic or propriety. When they came together this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Julian's arms encircled Sarah's waist, pulling her against him while her hands tangled in his hair, holding him close as their lips met again. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more urgent, full of need that had been building for months. Sarah's body molded against Julian's perfectly, and he marveled at how she seemed to fit every hollow place in his soul that had been empty for 7 years. They sank onto the sofa together, hands exploring with reverent curiosity. Julian traced the elegant curve of Sarah's neck, feeling her pulse flutter beneath his fingertips. Sarah's palms mapped the broad planes of his chest, discovering that beneath his grief-worn exterior was a man still capable of strength and passion. "Are you sure?" Julian asked, his voice rough with desire and concern. Sarah's answer was to kiss him with an intensity that left no room for doubt. For the first time in 7 years, Julian allowed himself to exist fully in the present moment, to feel desire and hope and the possibility of happiness that didn't require anyone's permission. They made love with tender urgency, two people who'd been emotionally starving, finally finding sustenance in each other's arms. Every touch was reverent, every kiss a promise, every whispered word a healing balm for wounds they'd carried too long in silence. Afterward, as they lay entwined on the narrow sofa, listening to the storm begin to abate, Julian felt something he'd thought lost forever: peace. Not the suspended animation he'd been existing in, but genuine serenity that came from being fully present with another person who understood him completely. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly, her head resting on his chest. Julian's arms tightened around her. "I don't know, but I know I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't pretend I don't feel—" "What?" "Alive," he said simply. "For the first time in 7 years, I feel alive." Outside, dawn was breaking through the clearing storm clouds, painting the sky in shades of hope that neither Julian nor Sarah had seen in far too long. They'd crossed a line from which there was no return, begun something that would complicate every aspect of their carefully ordered lives. But as they held each other in the growing light, both knew they would face those complications together. Love, they'd learned, wasn't always convenient or simple or socially acceptable. Sometimes it grew in the shadows of loss, nurtured by understanding and kindness until it became too strong to deny. The woman who'd sent anonymous birthday cards for 7 years was anonymous no longer, and the man who'd been living in suspended animation had finally chosen to live again, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 3. The morning after changed everything and nothing. Julian returned to his empty apartment where Marissa's presence lingered in every carefully preserved detail, but for the first time in 7 years, he didn't feel haunted by the memories. Instead, he felt grateful for the love he'd shared with his wife, for the woman who'd helped him remember how to feel alive, for the possibility that his heart was large enough to honor both past and present. Sarah arrived home to her small apartment exhausted but transformed. She'd spent years caring for others while neglecting her own needs, convinced that her worth came through service rather than simply being cherished. Last night, Julian had shown her a different truth, that she deserved to be loved not for what she could give, but for who she was. But in the harsh light of day, reality presented itself with uncomfortable clarity. Sarah was in love with a married man whose wife she cared for professionally. Julian was developing feelings for his comatose wife's nurse, a situation that violated every ethical boundary imaginable. When they saw each other next, during Julian's regular evening visit, the air between them crackled with awareness neither could hide. Every casual interaction felt charged with significance. When Sarah checked Marissa's monitors, Julian found himself watching the gentle competence of her hands, and remembering how those same hands had traced his skin with reverent exploration. When Julian read aloud to his wife, Sarah lingered longer than necessary, drawn by the rich timbre of his voice and the way he'd whispered her name in the darkness. "How is she today?" Julian asked, the routine question taking on new layers of meaning. "Stable," Sarah replied, her professional mask firmly in place despite the way her pulse jumped when their fingers accidentally brushed as she handed him Marissa's chart. "Dr. Okafor will be conducting her quarterly evaluation next week." They were careful not to touch deliberately, but the accidental contacts felt electric. A hand steadying an elbow, fingers meeting over a water glass, shoulders brushing as they passed in the narrow room. Each moment of connection sent awareness spiraling through both of them, making the professional distance they tried to maintain feel increasingly impossible. 3 days later, Julian witnessed something that triggered an unexpected stab of jealousy. Dr. Martinez, the handsome new resident, was making Sarah laugh as they discussed patient care protocols near the nurses' station. Her genuine amusement, the way her face lit up with joy, the casual manner in which the young doctor touched her shoulder, all of it combined to create a possessive response Julian had no right to feel. He watched from down the corridor, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name or claim. Sarah belonged to herself, not to him. They'd shared one night, crossed one line, but that didn't give him any ownership over her attention or affection. Yet seeing another man make her smile created an ache in his chest that felt suspiciously like territorial jealousy. When Martinez leaned closer to show Sarah something on his tablet, Julian turned away, unable to watch. The rational part of his mind understood he had no claim on Sarah's interactions with colleagues. The emotional part wanted to march over there and remind everyone that she was, what? His wife's nurse? His secret lover? A woman he had no right to protect or possess? The uncertainty was maddening. Later that evening, as Julian and Sarah found themselves alone in the elevator, the memory of her laugh seemed to fill the small space with charged tension. Neither spoke, but both were acutely aware of the other's presence. When the elevator shuddered slightly between floors, a common occurrence in the aging building, they swayed together involuntarily, and suddenly they were standing close enough to share breath. Sarah's perfume, light and floral, mixed with the clinical scent of hospital disinfectant in a combination that was becoming uniquely hers in Julian's mind. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, met his in the elevator's dim lighting, and the carefully maintained professional distance between them evaporated like morning mist. Sarah, Julian began, his voice rough with suppressed longing. We can't, she whispered, but she didn't step away. Not here. Not where anyone could see. The elevator resumed its normal operation, arriving at their floor with a soft ding that felt like a reprieve from temptation. They separated hastily, both breathing harder than the situation warranted, both shaken by how easily their carefully constructed boundaries crumbled when they were alone together. The following week brought a professional crisis that forced them into closer contact than either had anticipated. During a routine consultation about Marissa's long-term care plan, they found themselves seated across from each other at a conference table with Dr. Okafor and the hospital's social worker, discussing options that ranged from continued intensive care to transitioning to a less intensive maintenance protocol. Mr. Thorne, Dr. Okafor said gently, it's been 7 years since your wife's accident. While we've seen patients wake from longer comas, the likelihood decreases significantly after this amount of time. Julian's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Dr. Okafor clarified. I'm simply ensuring you understand all available options as we plan for your wife's continued care. Sarah watched Julian's face carefully, seeing the way his jaw tightened with controlled emotion. She knew how much these quarterly evaluations cost him, the forced acknowledgement that Marissa showed no signs of improvement, the clinical discussion of his wife's condition as if she were merely a collection of symptoms rather than the woman he'd once planned to grow old with. Her condition remains unchanged, the social worker added gently. But that doesn't mean there aren't quality of life considerations we should discuss. When they reached for the same medical file, Sarah's fingers brushed against Julian's, and the simple contact sent heat spiraling through both of them. The touch lasted a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and both were acutely aware of Dr. Okafor's sharp gaze taking in the interaction. After the meeting, Julian felt emotionally raw in the way these evaluations always left him. 7 years of hoping, 7 years of medical updates that confirmed his worst fears while offering no resolution. As he walked toward Marissa's room, he found Sarah waiting for him in the corridor. Are you all right? She asked quietly. Julian looked at her, this woman who'd been sending him anonymous comfort for years, who understood his pain in ways no one else could, who'd become the bright spot in his carefully controlled existence, and felt his composure finally crack. No, he admitted. I'm not all right. I haven't been all right for 7 years. Sarah glanced around the corridor, ensuring they were alone, then stepped closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, the steady comfort of her attention. You don't have to be all right, she said softly. Not with me. The words were a balm to wounds he'd been carrying in isolation for too long. Julian had spent 7 years trying to be the perfect devoted husband, the man who never wavered in his loyalty, who never complained about the impossible situation that had become his life. But with Sarah, he could admit the truth, that he was tired, that he was lonely, that sometimes he resented the weight of responsibility that kept him tied to a woman who might never wake up. I dream about her sometimes, Julian confessed, his voice barely audible. But lately, I dream about you too. And I don't know what that makes me. Human, Sarah replied without hesitation. It makes you human. They stood in the corridor, not touching but connected by understanding that went deeper than physical contact. Around them, the hospital continued its routine, nurses making rounds, families visiting loved ones, the constant hum of machines sustaining life. But in their small bubble of shared honesty, Julian and Sarah found something neither had expected to discover: acceptance without judgment, compassion without conditions. That evening, Julian made a decision that would change the trajectory of their relationship. Instead of going home after his visit with Marissa, he waited in the hospital parking garage until Sarah's shift ended at 11. When she emerged, clearly exhausted after a 14-hour day, he was leaning against her car. Julian, Sarah approached cautiously, glancing around the dimly lit garage. What are you doing here? I wanted to see you, he said simply. Away from the hospital. Away from everything else. Sarah's heart rate accelerated at the implication. away from Marissa, away from professional boundaries, away from the complicated ethics of their situation. Just Julian and Sarah, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. "We could get coffee," Julian suggested, "or I could cook dinner. I could try to cook dinner. I'm not sure my skills have improved much in 7 years of living alone." The offer was so normal, so wonderfully ordinary that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had offered to cook for her? When was the last time someone had wanted to spend time with her simply for the pleasure of her company rather than her professional skills? "I'd like that," she said, her voice soft with gratitude and something that felt dangerously close to love. They drove separately to Julian's apartment, a modern space overlooking the river that still bore traces of the life he'd once shared with Marissa. But tonight, as Julian moved around the kitchen preparing a simple pasta dinner, Sarah noticed something different. The apartment felt less like a shrine and more like a home where someone actually lived. "You redecorated," she observed, noting the fresh flowers on the counter, the way curtains had been opened to let in evening light. Julian paused in his preparation, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. Small changes, nothing dramatic. But Sarah understood the significance. For 7 years, Julian had preserved every detail of his life with Marissa, as if changing anything would dishonor her memory. The fresh flowers, the opened curtains, the fact that he'd invited another woman into this space, all of it represented a monumental shift in how he viewed his right to continued living. They ate dinner at the small table where Julian had once shared countless meals with his wife, but tonight the conversation flowed easily between them. Sarah told him about her sister Keisha, who was finishing her senior year of college, and worried constantly about Sarah's tendency to put everyone else's needs before her own. Julian shared stories about his architectural work, his passion for creating spaces that promoted healing and hope. "I designed the new wing where Marissa's room is located," Julian admitted as they lingered over wine. "The family consultation rooms, the natural lighting, the way the corridors are arranged to provide privacy while maintaining open sightlines for staff. I created all of that." Sarah stared at him, understanding dawning. "You designed the space where we fell in love," Julian finished, his voice rough with emotion. "I never imagined I'd be living in the spaces I created. But yes, I designed the room where we first kissed." The irony was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Julian had created healing spaces, never knowing he'd one day need them for his own emotional recovery. The room where he'd fallen in love with Sarah had been designed by his own hands during happier times when he'd believed the future held only joy and shared dreams. After dinner, they moved to the couch, drawn together by attraction neither bothered to resist anymore. When Julian pulled Sarah into his arms, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Her head found the perfect spot, on his shoulder, and his fingers combed through her hair with reverent tenderness. "This is dangerous," Sarah murmured, but she made no move to pull away. "Everything worthwhile is dangerous," Julian replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Flying is dangerous, love is dangerous, living is dangerous." They talked until nearly dawn, sharing stories and fears and dreams with the kind of intimacy that made physical desire seem secondary to the deeper connection growing between them. When Sarah finally fell asleep in Julian's arms, both felt something they hadn't experienced in years, peace that came not from avoiding difficult truths, but from facing them together. But morning brought renewed awareness of their impossible situation. Sarah woke in Julian's arms, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Then reality intruded with its complicated ethics and professional boundaries, and the inescapable fact that Julian was married to the woman she cared for every day. "I should go," Sarah said reluctantly. Julian tightened his arms around her. "Should and want are different things." "Your wife is part of this," Julian said firmly. "She's part of me, part of my story, part of who I am. But so are you now, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." The declaration was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had spent years believing she was destined to care for others without expecting love in return. Julian had spent 7 years convinced his capacity for love had died with his wife's consciousness. They'd been wrong about themselves, about each other, about the heart's infinite ability to expand rather than replace. But understanding their feelings didn't solve the practical problems they faced. Sarah still had professional obligations that made their relationship ethically questionable. Julian still had a wife who might wake up tomorrow or never. They were building something beautiful on foundations that couldn't support the weight of public scrutiny or professional judgment. As Sarah prepared to leave Julian's apartment, both knew they'd crossed another line. They were no longer two people fighting unexpected attraction. They were two people in love, regardless of how inconvenient or complicated that love might be. Have you ever found yourself caught between honoring your past and embracing your future? Between what's expected and what your heart demands? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to see if Julian and Sarah can find a way through this impossible situation. The following weeks established a pattern that felt both wonderful and unsustainable. Julian and Sarah maintained professional distance at the hospital while developing emotional intimacy everywhere else. They met for coffee before her shifts, shared late dinners after his evening visits with Marissa, spent weekends exploring the city like any other couple falling in love. But the secrecy was taking its toll. Sarah found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, worried that colleagues might notice the way she smiled when Julian appeared, the way her entire demeanor softened in his presence. Julian struggled with guilt that came in waves, not for loving Sarah, but for the happiness he felt while his wife remained unconscious just floors below their clandestine meetings. The crisis that threatened everything began with whispers. Hospital staff members were naturally observant, trained to notice subtle changes in patient conditions, family dynamics, and professional relationships. Sarah and Julian's growing connection hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Dr. Martinez, the resident who'd been flirting harmlessly with Sarah for weeks, was the first to voice concerns. During a staff meeting, he mentioned that Mr. Thorne seemed to be spending unusual amounts of time at the hospital, often arriving during off hours and lingering in areas outside his wife's room. "He's been grief-stricken for 7 years," Dr. Okafor replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps he's finally beginning to engage with the healing process." But other staff members had noticed things too. Julian's improved appearance. He'd started paying attention to his clothing again, had gotten his hair cut, seemed to carry himself with renewed energy. Sarah's increased happiness, the way she hummed while working, the fact that she'd started wearing subtle makeup and had bought new scrubs in colors that flattered her complexion. Individually, these changes might have gone unnoticed. Together, they painted a picture that made some people uncomfortable. A grieving husband showing signs of recovery wasn't unusual. A dedicated nurse being especially kind to a long-term patient's family wasn't problematic. But a grieving husband and a beautiful nurse, both transformation at the same time, both seeming happier and more vibrant, both lingering in each other's presence whenever possible. That combination raised questions about professional boundaries and appropriate relationships. The first official complaint came from an unexpected source. Davis, Julian's older brother, had been watching his siblings' gradual transformation with growing concern. Where others might see healthy signs of recovery, Davis saw betrayal of his sister-in-law's memory. During a tense confrontation in Julian's apartment, Davis voiced fears that had been building for weeks. "You're different," Davis accused, pacing the living room where Julian had recently entertained Sarah. "You're acting like a man who's moved on, Julian. Marissa isn't dead. She's lying in that hospital room, dependent on machines, while you're out here living like a bachelor again." Julian felt his temper rise at the implication. "I visit her every day. I read to her, I talk to her, and I make sure she has the best care possible. And then you come home and what? Date her nurse?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Julian's silence confirmed what Davis had suspected, and his older brother's face darkened with disappointment. "Jesus, Julian, her nurse? The woman who's supposed to be caring for your wife professionally?" "You don't understand." "I understand plenty," Davis interrupted. "I understand that you're having an affair with a woman who has professional obligations to your comatose wife. I understand that you're risking her career and your wife's care for your own selfish needs." The words were harsh, but not entirely inaccurate, and Julian found himself unable to formulate a defense that didn't sound like justification. How could he explain that Sarah had been caring for his emotional well-being anonymously for 7 years? How could he make Davis understand that love wasn't a finite resource, that caring for Sarah didn't diminish his love for Marissa? I'm going to file a complaint with the hospital, Davis announced. This relationship is inappropriate, and it needs to end before it destroys both of your reputations. Julian's blood ran cold. You can't do that. You'll destroy Sarah's career. Then end it voluntarily, Davis challenged. Choose your wife's dignity over your own desires. The ultimatum forced Julian to confront the full implications of his relationship with Sarah. He'd been so focused on the joy of connection, on the relief of feeling alive again, that he'd minimized the professional risks Sarah faced. If Davis filed a complaint, if the hospital launched an investigation, Sarah could lose her nursing license. Everything she'd worked for, her entire career built on caring for vulnerable patients, could be destroyed because she'd fallen in love with the wrong man. That evening, Julian arrived at the hospital with a heavy heart and an impossible decision to make. He found Sarah in Marissa's room, checking monitors with her usual competent care, unaware that their secret was no longer secret, that forces beyond their control were aligning to tear them apart. When she looked up and saw his expression, her face immediately reflected concern. "What's wrong?" Julian glanced at his wife's peaceful form, then back at the woman who'd taught him to live again. The irony was devastating. To protect Sarah's ability to care for Marissa, he might have to give up the relationship that had brought meaning back to his life. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "but not here." As they left Marissa's room together, neither knowing it might be one of the last times they could do so openly, Julian realized that loving Sarah might require the ultimate sacrifice, letting her go to save her career, even if it destroyed them both. Chapter 4. The conversation that would change everything took place in Julian's car in the hospital parking garage, away from curious eyes and professional scrutiny. As rain drummed against the windshield, Julian told Sarah about Davis's ultimatum, about the threatened complaint, about the impossible choice between protecting her career and continuing their relationship. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her face growing pale as the full implications became clear. She'd known their relationship was ethically complicated, but she'd convinced herself that her exemplary professional record and genuine care for Marissa would protect her from serious consequences. She'd been naive. "He's right," she said finally, her voice hollow with realization. "Your brother is absolutely right." "Sarah, no, I could lose my license, Julian. 8 years of education, 5 years building my reputation in specialized care. All of it could disappear because I fell in love with a patient's husband." The clinical way she described their relationship felt like a physical blow. Julian reached for her hand, but she pulled away, creating distance that felt symbolic of the chasm opening between them. "It's not that simple," Julian argued. "What we have isn't just an affair. You've been part of my life for 7 years through those cards. You understand me in ways no one else does." "Understanding doesn't make it appropriate," Sarah replied, tears threatening. "I'm supposed to be Marissa's advocate, her protector. Instead, I fell in love with her husband. How is that not a complete betrayal of everything I'm supposed to represent?" The guilt in her voice was devastating. Julian realized that while he'd been celebrating his renewed capacity for love, Sarah had been struggling with the ethical implications of caring for his wife while falling for him. The weight of professional responsibility that he'd never fully considered had been crushing her, even as their relationship blossomed. "What do you want to do?" Julian asked, though he dreaded her answer. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I'm going to request a transfer to another unit," she said, "tonight, before your brother files any complaint." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. "You can't. Who will take care of Marissa? Any competent nurse can provide the care she needs. I'm not irreplaceable, Julian. I just convinced myself I was because it gave me an excuse to stay close to you." The admission revealed the depth of her internal struggle. Sarah had been questioning her own motivations for months, wondering if her dedication to Marissa's care was genuine or simply a justification for remaining in Julian's orbit. The uncertainty had been eating at her professional confidence, making her doubt everything about her relationship with both husband and wife. "Don't do this," Julian pleaded. "Don't let them destroy what we have." "What we have is built on ethically questionable foundations," Sarah replied. Maybe it's better to end it before it gets worse." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah's heart was breaking. Julian had become her hope for a different kind of future, one where she was loved not just for her capacity to care for others, but for herself. Giving him up felt like amputating a vital part of her soul. The following morning, Sarah submitted her transfer request to Dr. Okafor, citing personal reasons and requesting immediate reassignment to the cardiac unit. Dr. Okafor, who'd been observing the subtle dynamics between Sarah and Julian for weeks, understood the subtext immediately. "This is about Mr. Thorne," Dr. Okafor said, settling into her office chair with the weariness of someone who'd navigated countless professional ethical dilemmas. Sarah's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. "I've maintained appropriate professional boundaries." "I'm not questioning your professional conduct," Dr. Okafor interrupted gently. "I'm questioning whether you're making this decision for the right reasons." The statement surprised Sarah, who'd expected censure or disappointment from her respected mentor. Instead, Dr. Okafor's tone held compassion and understanding that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears she'd been holding back for hours. "He's married," Sarah said simply. "To a woman who has been in a vegetative state for 7 years, Dr. Okafor replied. "A woman whose prognosis grows dimmer with each passing year, whose husband has devoted his life to sitting vigil beside her bed. That doesn't make it appropriate. It makes it human," Dr. Okafor said, echoing words Sarah had heard from Julian. "You're not the first healthcare professional to develop feelings for a patient's family member, and you won't be the last. The question isn't whether you have feelings, it's whether those feelings have compromised your professional judgment." Sarah considered the question honestly. Had her growing love for Julian affected her care of Marissa? If anything, she'd become more attentive to his wife's needs, more determined to provide excellent care, more invested in maintaining hope for any sign of improvement. Her feelings for Julian had made her want to be worthy of his respect, which meant being the best possible nurse for his wife. "Have you noticed any decline in the quality of Marissa's care?" Dr. Okafor asked, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "No," Sarah admitted. "If anything, I've been more attentive." "Have you used your position to manipulate Julian's emotions or create inappropriate situations?" "No." The answer was immediate and certain. Their relationship had developed despite professional boundaries, not because of them. "Then what exactly are you punishing yourself for? For caring too much? For finding connection with someone who understands loss as deeply as you do?" The questions forced Sarah to examine her motivations more honestly. Was she requesting a transfer to protect her professional ethics? Or was she running from the complications of loving someone in an impossible situation? "His brother is threatening to file a complaint," Sarah said quietly. "Let him," Dr. Okafor replied with surprising firmness. "I've been observing your conduct with the Thorne family for over 2 years. Your care has been exemplary. Your professional behavior beyond reproach. One man's family politics don't dictate hospital personnel decisions." The support was unexpected and overwhelming. Sarah had prepared herself for professional censure, for lectures about appropriate boundaries and ethical conduct. Instead, she found an ally who understood the difference between professional misconduct and human connection that developed despite careful boundaries. "What should I do?" Sarah asked, feeling lost in the ethical complexities of her situation. "That depends," Dr. Okafor said. "Do you love him?" The direct question cut through all the professional justifications and ethical concerns to the simple truth underneath. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "And do you believe he loves you?" "Yes." Then perhaps the question isn't whether your relationship is convenient or socially acceptable, but whether it's genuine and meaningful enough to weather the complications it will certainly bring. Dr. Okafor leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the analytical gaze that made her such an excellent diagnostician. "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you," she said finally. "Julian Thorne was dying by degrees before you came into his life. Oh, he was performing the motions of devotion, visiting every day, maintaining vigil. But he wasn't living. He was existing in suspended animation, serving penance for a tragedy that wasn't his fault." Sarah listened intently, recognizing the truth in Dr. Okafor's observations. Since your relationship began, and yes, I've noticed the changes in both of you, Julian has shown the first signs of genuine healing I've seen in 7 years. He engages differently with medical updates, asks more thoughtful questions about Marissa's care, seems to understand that loving her doesn't require sacrificing his own life. The assessment forced Sarah to consider something she'd been avoiding, that her relationship with Julian might actually be beneficial for everyone involved, including Marissa. A husband who was emotionally alive and psychologically healthy was better equipped to make difficult decisions about his wife's care than one who was frozen by guilt and grief. "I'm not advocating for inappropriate relationships," Dr. Okafor clarified, "but I am suggesting that sometimes life presents us with situations that don't fit neatly into professional guidelines, and wisdom involves understanding the difference between ethical violations and human complexity." That evening, Sarah found Julian in Marissa's room, but this time she approached the situation differently. Instead of maintaining careful professional distance, she allowed herself to see the full picture: a devoted husband reading to his comatose wife, a man who'd learned to balance honoring his past with embracing his present, someone who'd found a way to love expansively rather than exclusively. "How was she today?" Julian asked, looking up from the book he'd been reading aloud. "Stable," Sarah replied, but she moved closer to the bed, studying Marissa's peaceful features with new understanding. "Julian, can I ask you something?" He set the book aside, giving her his full attention. "Of course. Do you think she would want you to be happy?" The question surprised him. "What do you mean?" "If Marissa could wake up right now, if she could see you as you've been for the past 7 years, frozen in grief, serving penance, refusing to live, do you think she'd approve?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. He thought about the woman he'd married, vibrant and full of life, passionate about social work because she believed everyone deserved advocacy and care. Marissa had been incapable of cruelty, had possessed a generous heart that wanted happiness for everyone around her. "She'd be furious with me," Julian said finally, a sad smile crossing his face. "She'd tell me I was wasting the life she couldn't live. That grief was supposed to honor the dead, not bury the living alongside them." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of their situation. She'd been so focused on the ethics of loving a married man that she'd forgotten to consider what the wife herself might have wanted for the husband she'd loved enough to marry. "I was going to transfer to another unit," Sarah admitted, "to end whatever this is between us before it destroys my career." Julian's face went pale. "And now? Now I'm wondering if running away is the right choice, or if it's just the easier one." They stood on opposite sides of Marissa's bed, two people who'd found love in the most complicated circumstances imaginable, trying to navigate between professional obligations and personal truth. The machines that sustained Marissa's life hummed quietly around them, a reminder of the complex realities that made their situation so difficult. "What do you want to do?" Julian asked. Sarah looked at him across the bed where his wife lay, this man who'd taught her that love didn't always arrive conveniently, that sometimes the most meaningful connections grew in the shadows of loss. She thought about Dr. Okafor's words, about the difference between ethical violations and human complexity, about the possibility that love could make them better caregivers rather than compromised ones. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "I want to continue caring for Marissa, and I want to continue caring for you. But I need you to understand something." "What?" "If we do this, if we build a relationship while navigating this situation, we have to be transparent about it. No more secrecy, no more hiding. We have to trust that doing the right thing in good faith will protect us from those who might not understand." Julian felt something unlock in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying without realizing. The prospect of openness, of not having to compartmentalize his feelings or sneak around like guilty teenagers, offered a kind of freedom he hadn't expected. "What about your brother's complaint?" Sarah asked. "Let him file it," Julian said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Let him explain to an ethics board why he thinks love is more scandalous than the kind of living death I was choosing before you came into my life." As they stood together in Marissa's room, no longer hiding their connection but not flaunting it either, Both Sarah and Julian felt something shift. They were choosing to trust that love. Genuine, thoughtful, carefully considered love was worth fighting for, even when it came wrapped in complications that had no easy answers. The road ahead would not be simple. There would be critics and complications, professional scrutiny and personal doubts. But for the first time since their relationship began, they were choosing to face those challenges together, with honesty and transparency that might just prove more powerful than secrecy and shame. Love, they were learning, sometimes required courage more than convenience, and both Sarah and Julian were finally ready to be brave. Chapter 5. The ethics hearing that Davis had threatened never materialized in the way anyone expected. When he arrived at the hospital to file his complaint, he found himself face to face with Dr. Okafor, who'd requested a meeting after learning about his intentions from Julian. "Mr. Thorne," Dr. Okafor said, settling into her office chair with professional composure, "I understand you have concerns about your brother's relationship with one of our nurses." Davis shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling less righteous than he had when making threats in Julian's apartment. "It's inappropriate. She's supposed to be caring for his wife professionally. And has there been any decline in the quality of that care?" The direct question caught Davis off guard. He'd been so focused on the perceived impropriety that he hadn't actually considered whether Marissa's treatment had suffered. I wouldn't know," he admitted. "I would," Dr. Okafor replied firmly. "I've been monitoring Marissa's care closely for 7 years. In the 2 years since Sarah Brown became her primary night nurse, the quality of care has been exceptional. Marissa's skin integrity is perfect, her positioning is managed expertly to prevent complications, her hygiene and dignity are maintained with uncommon attention to detail." Davis found himself on the defensive. "But the relationship with Julian has resulted in the first signs of psychological healing I've observed in your brother since his wife's accident," Dr. Okafor interrupted. "Julian is finally engaging meaningfully with medical decisions, asking thoughtful questions about care options, and showing signs of the emotional resilience that will be necessary if difficult decisions need to be made regarding Marissa's future." The assessment forced Davis to confront something he'd been avoiding, that his righteous indignation might be misplaced, that his concern for propriety was potentially harmful to everyone involved. "Are you saying their relationship is appropriate?" Davis asked. "I'm saying their relationship appears to be making both of them better at their respective roles. Sarah as Marissa's caregiver, Julian as Marissa's medical advocate and decision-maker. Sometimes life presents us with situations that don't fit neatly into conventional categories." Dr. Okafor leaned forward, her expression serious but compassionate. "Your brother spent 7 years dying by degrees, Mr. Thorne. He was performing devotion while destroying himself with guilt and suspended grief. If his connection with Sarah Brown has helped him rediscover his capacity for living while maintaining his commitment to his wife's care, I fail to see how that constitutes a problem requiring intervention." The conversation left Davis shaken and uncertain. He'd arrived prepared to file a complaint based on moral outrage, but found himself questioning whether his interference was protective or destructive, whether his concept of loyalty was actually harmful to everyone involved. Meanwhile, Julian and Sarah were navigating their own complex reconciliation. The decision to pursue their relationship openly, or at least without active concealment, felt both liberating and terrifying. They continued to maintain professional boundaries at the hospital, but they stopped pretending they were merely acquaintances when others observed them together. The shift was subtle but noticeable. Sarah no longer carefully avoided eye contact during Julian's visits. Julian stopped leaving the moment other family members or medical staff appeared. They allowed their natural affection and respect for each other to show, even in professional settings. The response from hospital staff was mixed, but generally more supportive than either had expected. Many nurses had observed Julian's 7-year vigil and understood the toll that kind of prolonged grief could take. Seeing him show signs of renewed engagement with life was viewed by most as positive development rather than betrayal. Dr. Martinez, who'd harbored his own interest in Sarah, graciously stepped back once the nature of her relationship with Julian became clear. Father Miguel, the hospital chaplain, who'd counseled both Julian and Sarah through various crises, offered quiet support and wisdom about the difference between moral complexity and moral failure. Love is rarely convenient, Father Miguel observed during a conversation with Julian about ethics and obligation. But love that makes us more compassionate, more thoughtful, more capable of caring for others, that kind of love serves a higher purpose than social convenience. 3 weeks after the crisis that almost destroyed their relationship, Julian made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked Sarah to accompany him to Marissa's room, not as her nurse, but as the woman he loved. "I want you to meet her," Julian said as they approached room 314. "Really meet her. Not as patient and caregiver, but as, I don't know how to describe it. As the woman who loved you first," Sarah said quietly, understanding immediately what Julian needed. They entered the room together, and Julian pulled a second chair close to Marissa's bed. For the first time since their relationship began, Sarah sat beside him, not as a medical professional, but as someone important to him personally. "Marissa," Julian said, taking his wife's hand while his other arm rested on the back of Sarah's chair, "I want you to meet Sarah. I know you already know her as your nurse, but I want you to know her as someone who's become very important to me." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd spent countless hours caring for this woman, speaking to her professionally, maintaining her dignity and comfort, but sitting here as Julian's, what? Girlfriend? Partner? Love interest? The situation was unprecedented in her experience. "She's the one who's been sending me birthday cards for 7 years, Julian continued, his voice growing stronger. "The woman who saw how lost I was and decided to send hope anonymously without expecting anything in return." Sarah reached out tentatively, placing her hand over Julian and Marissa's joined hands. The gesture felt profound. 3 people connected by circumstances beyond any of their control, by love that had taken different forms but remained genuine. "I promise you," Sarah said, speaking directly to Marissa, "that loving Julian hasn't made me care for you any less. If anything, understanding how much he loves you has made me more determined to provide you with the best possible care." Julian felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for years. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't compartmentalizing his emotions, wasn't struggling to balance loyalty to his wife against hope for his own future. He was simply present, loving both women differently but genuinely, honoring his past while embracing his present. "I don't know what the future holds," Julian continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was acknowledging. "I don't know if you'll wake up tomorrow or never. But I know that Sarah has taught me something important, that love isn't finite, that caring for her doesn't diminish what I feel for you." As if in response to his words, something extraordinary happened. Marissa's right index finger, which had been motionless for 7 years, moved slightly against Julian's palm. The movement was so subtle that initially neither Julian nor Sarah noticed it, but the monitors around Marissa's bed registered the change. A slight spike in brain activity, a barely perceptible increase in muscle response. The equipment that had been measuring steady, unchanging vital signs for years suddenly showed variations that made Sarah's trained eye widen with recognition. "Julian," Sarah whispered, pointing to the monitors. "Look," Julian followed her gaze, seeing patterns he'd learned to read over 7 years of vigil. For the first time since the accident, the lines weren't perfectly flat and predictable. There were fluctuations, small but unmistakable. "What does it mean?" Julian asked, his heart racing. Sarah studied the displays carefully, her professional training overriding personal emotions. "It could mean neurological response. It could be random electrical activity. I need to get Dr. Okafor." But before she could move, Marissa's finger twitched again, this time more noticeably. Julian stared at their joined hands, certain he'd felt deliberate pressure against his palm. "Marissa." Julian leaned closer, his voice urgent with hope and terror. "Marissa, can you hear me?" The response was minimal, but unmistakable. A slight tightening of her fingers around his, lasting only seconds but representing the first voluntary movement in 7 years. Dr. Okafor's arrival 15 minutes later confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Marissa was showing signs of emerging consciousness. Not dramatic awakening like in movies, but subtle indicators that her brain activity was changing in ways that hadn't been seen since the accident. This could be temporary, Dr. Okafor warned as she conducted preliminary neurological assessments, or it could be the beginning of a longer process. We'll need to run extensive tests, adjust medications, monitor continuously. Julian felt his world tilt sideways once again. For 7 years, he'd hoped for exactly this moment, signs that Marissa might return to him. Now that it was potentially happening, he found himself caught between joy and devastating complexity, because he was no longer the same man who'd sat beside her bed 7 years ago, faithfully waiting for her return. He'd grown, changed, fallen in love with someone else. The person Marissa might wake up to would be fundamentally different from the husband she'd lost. Sarah understood the implications immediately and completely. If Marissa was beginning to wake up, everything changed. Julian's attention would rightfully need to focus on his wife's recovery. The relationship they'd built would need to be reevaluated in light of new realities. "I should go," Sarah said quietly, stepping back from the bedside. "No," Julian said firmly, surprising himself. "Stay. Please." The request was unprecedented and complicated and probably inappropriate, but Julian found he couldn't bear the thought of facing this moment alone. Sarah had been part of his healing journey. He needed her to be part of whatever came next. Over the following hours, Marissa's responses became more frequent, though still minimal. A slight movement of her head toward familiar voices, increased brain activity when Julian read from her favorite book, eye movements beneath closed lids that suggested some level of awareness. Dr. Okafor was cautiously optimistic, but realistic about expectations. If she's emerging from the coma, and that's still a very big if, the process will likely be gradual. She may have significant cognitive and physical deficits. Recovery, if it occurs, could take months or years. Julian absorbed this information while holding Sarah's hand, no longer caring who might see or judge. He'd spent 7 years preparing for the possibility that Marissa might never wake up. He'd never prepared for the possibility that she might wake up to find him in love with someone else. But as the night progressed, as medical staff came and went conducting tests and adjustments, Julian realized something profound. His love for Sarah hadn't made him less capable of caring about Marissa's recovery. It had made him more emotionally equipped to handle whatever came next. The man who'd been frozen in grief for 7 years might have been paralyzed by the complexity of this situation. But the man who'd learned to love again, who'd discovered that hearts could expand rather than just transfer affection, felt capable of navigating even this unprecedented territory. "What happens now?" Sarah asked during a quiet moment when they were alone with Marissa. "I don't know," Julian admitted, "but I know I don't want to face it without you. Whatever comes next, whether she recovers fully, partially, or not at all, I want you with me." The declaration was both beautiful and impossible. If Marissa woke up, how could Julian explain his relationship with her nurse? How could Sarah continue providing professional care while personally involved with the patient's husband? How could any of them navigate the emotional complexity of a situation that had no precedent, no guidelines, no easy answers? But as dawn broke through the hospital room windows, as monitors continued showing encouraging signs of neurological activity, Julian and Sarah made a decision that would define their future. They would face whatever came with honesty, compassion, and the kind of love that was strong enough to embrace complexity rather than demand simplicity. The woman who'd sent anonymous birthday cards for 7 years was no longer anonymous. The man who'd been living in suspended animation had chosen to fully embrace life, and the wife who'd been absent for 7 years was showing signs of potential return. 3 lives intersected in ways that challenged every conventional understanding of love, loyalty, and appropriate relationships. But sometimes life doesn't offer conventional choices. Sometimes it offers only the opportunity to act with integrity, compassion, and the courage to love expansively rather than exclusively. As hospital staff continued monitoring Marissa's condition, as family members were notified of the potential developments, as the complexity of their situation became even more challenging, Julian and Sarah held each other's hands and prepared to face whatever came next. Their love story had begun in the shadows of loss. Now it would be tested in the harsh light of recovery, scrutiny, and choices that had no perfect answers. But they would face those choices together, with hearts large enough to hold multiple truths, strong enough to weather any storm. The journey ahead would be complicated beyond imagination. But for the first time in 7 years, Julian Thorne was ready to live fully in whatever reality awaited, as a devoted husband, a man in love, and someone who'd finally learned that the heart's capacity for love knows no limits. Love, they'd discovered, wasn't about choosing between past and present. Sometimes it was about finding the courage to honor both, to create space for complexity, to trust that genuine care for multiple people could coexist without diminishing anyone involved. The woman who'd been sending him hope for 7 years had become his hope for whatever future awaited. And together, they would discover whether love really could conquer all, even the most impossible circumstances imaginable. In Marissa's hospital room, surrounded by machines that sustained life and monitors that measured hope, 3 people began a journey that would redefine everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and the infinite capacity of the human heart to heal, grow, and embrace whatever truth life offered. The anonymous cards had served their purpose. Now it was time for all of them, Julian, Sarah, and potentially Marissa, to write the next chapter of their story together, whatever that chapter might hold. Julian and Sarah's love had been born in impossible circumstances. Now it would be tested by circumstances even more impossible. But they were ready to discover that sometimes the most meaningful love stories aren't the ones that follow conventional rules. They're the ones that create their own truth through courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment to honoring the complexity of human hearts. The birthday cards had stopped being anonymous. The love they represented had only just begun to be fully understood. And in the quiet moments between medical assessments and family notifications, Julian and Sarah held each other close and prepared to face whatever impossible, beautiful, complicated future awaited them all. Love, they'd learned, was never about choosing the easy path. It was about choosing the path that honored everyone involved, even when that path led through territory no one had ever mapped before. Together, they were ready to be pioneers in the uncharted landscape of love that refuses to be contained by conventional boundaries or expectations. Their story was just beginning. And whatever ending awaited, they would write it together, with hearts brave enough to love without limits, and souls strong enough to face any truth life might reveal.